Did you know that a single bee is responsible for pollinating 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat? That's right. Without bees, our plates would be pretty empty. In fact, one bee's worth of labor is equivalent to 134,000 human workers. So let us find out what exactly makes bees so valuable and why it takes 134,000 humans to replace just one. First things first, what do we mean by labor? For humans, labor means working. We work in order to earn money so that we can buy food. But bees don't use money, so they don't have jobs. They don't even have bosses. So how do we measure their work? Well, bees work by collecting pollen from plant to plant and carrying it back to their hive. This pollen is what plants use to make more plants, kind of like how people use seeds to grow crops. The way it works is that inside the flower parts are male and female bits that produce pollen and egg cells. The male bits are called stamens, and they produce pollen, which is basically tiny little grains of genetic material. The female part is called the pistil, and it has a sticky top called the stigma that catches the pollen. When the pollen grain lands on the stigma, it starts growing a little pollen tube down into the pistil. And when that pollen tube reaches the egg cell, fertilization happens and the plant is one step closer to making more plants. Now, if a plant wants to make more plants, it could just drop its pollen onto the stigma of a flower that's close by. But that's not how plants usually do it. Instead, plants rely on animals like bees to pick up their pollen and drop it off in another flower. That's because most flowers are on plants that are pretty far apart. So an animal like a bee that can fly is needed to get the pollen from one plant to another. This is called pollination, and it's a lot easier than it sounds. All a bee has to do is fly from flower to flower and collect pollen on its body. Bees collect pollen on their bodies because their furry bodies are covered with tiny hairs that like to stick to pollen. It's like static cling, but for pollen. Once the bee is all done collecting pollen, it flies back to the hive so that it can store the pollen and make more bees. But not before some of that pollen falls off of it and onto more plants, which is how pollination works. So now that we know how pollination works, let's go back to that original question. Why does it take 134,000 human workers to replace one bee? Well, a big part of it is because of how much work a bee does. A single honeybee can collect up to 200 million pollen grains in its lifetime. That's a lot of potential plants. And even though not all of those pollen grains will turn into plants, a lot of them will. And that's just one bee. If you want to see how many human workers it would take to collect that much pollen, all you have to do is divide the number of pollen grains a bee collects in its lifetime by the number of pollen grains a human can collect in their lifetime. The reason we say it takes 134,000 human workers to replace a single bee is because we also have to account for how much food a bee produces. In other words, how many plants that bee pollinates actually end up producing food that we can eat. A full-grown honeybee colony can produce up to 40 pounds of honey in a year. That's a lot of food. We assume that each bee is responsible for pollinating roughly one tomato plant. Then the tomato plant produces 10 pounds of tomatoes. That means that one bee's worth of labor results in 14 pounds of food. Not bad for one little bee. But again, this is a lot of food that comes from a lot of plants. So to get the full picture, we need to do some more math. Each human worker can only pollinate one tomato plant, and each tomato plant produces 10 pounds of tomatoes. Then we just divide 14 pounds of food by 10 pounds of food per plant to get 1.4. So it really does take 134,000 human workers to replace just one bee. Next time you take a bite of something delicious, remember the bees and all the other pollinators that help make our food. Speaking of pollinators, did you know that there's a yummy way to support our channel? Click the link below to find out how you can help us grow so that we can keep making videos like this one. Thank you for watching.